Welcome, everyone. This is Lynette Kraft, Chief Science Officer at ACSM. I want to welcome you to this month's Brown Bag in Science webinar. Today, we are really fortunate to have David Ferguson with us. David is an assistant professor at Michigan State University. He received his PhD in exercise physiology from Texas A&M University and his postdoctoral training in physiology from Baylor College of Medicine. David's been really active with ACSM. He is currently the chair of the Student Affairs Committee, and formerly he has also been the student representative to our Board of Trustees. David's research is on the safety and human performance of race car drivers and pit crews, and he has worked with IMSA, NASCAR, Indycar, Formula One teams, working to develop training and safety protocols to increase performance. He's also been involved with the Motorsport Health and Safety Task Force at ACSM, and we're really pleased to have him with us today. So we are going to turn it over to David. We have folks here at the ACSM National Office who are participating, as well as many of you who are joining us remotely. We're going to save questions until the end of the webinar, so if you are joining us remotely, go ahead and type your questions into the question box on the screen, and we'll get to those at the end. And at this time, we'll turn it over to David.
Great, thank you, Lynette. I'm going to go and start my broadcast here. So thank you, everyone, for attending. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to me talk about something I'm very passionate about. I've had the pleasure of working in racing for probably over the last 15 years, and prior to that, I was an amateur race car driver and kind of enjoyed going from point A to point A as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is physical fitness and blood glucose and how they influence performance in IndyCar racing. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to make this kind of a casual conversation, not so much a manuscript journal read in a way like that. So if you see something you're interested in, you want to ask a question, I encourage you to write in. I'm happy to discuss that a little bit later once I finish the talk. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm the director of the Spartan Motorsport Performance Lab here at Michigan State University. And as Lynette said on her introduction, our goal is to improve the safety and human performance of race car drivers and pit crews. We've had the distinct pleasure of working with Indycar, NASCAR, Formula One, sports car teams over there. You can see a couple pictures on the slide here from the group. We're very lucky to have access to some great equipment, some great teams. And so we've been able to really collect some interesting data related to the human performance of race car drivers. And when I say interesting, the reason I say that is there's not a lot of information out there. So what always baffles me is when I talk about the work I do, people often say, oh, I'm a car guy, I'm really into racing, this is really cool. However, there's really less than about 60 publications on human performance of drivers and pit crews ever published. And later on the talk, we'll kind of discuss a little bit about that, maybe why that is and how we need to improve that. But for the focus of today's talk, I think it's very timely because I realize ACSM is based in Indianapolis. And if you're not aware of this, this Sunday is the 102nd Indianapolis 500. This is a very special race. For those of you that are, I imagine if you're attending this webinar, you probably know what the Indy 500 is. But just so that we're all on the same page, the Annapolis 500 is over 100 years old. Okay, it's a race. It's probably one of the biggest race weekends of the year for all types of racing. Happens in Speedway, Indiana. Those that live in Indianapolis are probably aware of the traffic problems it'll hold. The Speedway can hold up to 400,000 people. It is a 2.5-mile course where you will see drivers pilot the most advanced race cars up to speeds of 235 miles per hour. So let's just think about that for a second. These individuals will be racing at that speed. So to give you an idea, they will be covering a football field a second. Now, they're just not along for the ride right there. They are actually having to control the car, avoid wrecks, avoid incidents, and be competitive with 33 other cars. So that in itself kind of leads the question of these individuals have to be masters at their skill set. They have to be the best of the best in order to pilot race cars. And what's interesting about that is this brings up the question, are race car drivers athletes? Don't they just sit there? That's the comments that a lot of my students make, and a lot of other individuals in the field will say is, oh, these guys aren't athletes, they just sit there. Well, while they're sitting there, several things are happening. So this is a snapshot of data that we've collected previously. There's a lot going on in this, but this is a physiological monitoring of a race car driver during race conditions. And we're looking at blood glucose, core temperature, skin temperature, breathing rate, respiratory rate, as well as heart rate. So we won't get into a lot of details on this, but let's just put some caveats here. In the race car, it's not uncommon to see heart rates ranging from 170 to 190 beats per minute, depending on the physical demands of the track. We see an increase in blood glucose. Okay, so we'll typically see a 20 to 30 point rise in blood glucose, partly due to adrenaline, partly due to mobilizing glycogen stores, so you actually have fuel available to working muscles. And now you've probably just heard me say working muscles, and you're probably thinking, well, they're just sitting there, what muscles are actually working? Well, first off, most of these in Indycar, there's no power steering, no power brakes. Okay, so that actually takes a lot of physical work to actually just maneuver the car. Additionally, during a race car drivers are exposed to a variety of G-forces, okay? Particularly under turning, braking, acceleration. These G's can range from 2.5 to 6 G's. Now, to kind of put that in perspective, a G is the force of gravity. So 4 times the force of gravity is 4 times gravity. So if you weighed 100 pounds at 4 G's, you would have a feeling as if you weighed 400 pounds. So think about having to be exposed to these forces in these conditions, and then still pilot a race car and make these quick decisions that you have to make. And if that wasn't enough, it further gets compounded by the fact that race car drivers wear fire protective clothing. These are 3-layer Nomex suits, gloves, shoes, protective helmets, sometimes a balaclava that protects their face. And thus, this roughly shuts off their ability to cool themselves via sweating. So what we see here, this orange line on my graph, is we start to see a rise in core temperature. Okay. Now that rise in core temperature, it's not uncommon for it to get close to 39, 40 degrees C. It's also not uncommon for these drivers to lose somewhere between 3 and 6 pounds of sweat over the course of a 4-hour race. So that alone makes me say this is very physically demanding. Okay. So the next question comes up, what makes an athlete? Okay. Is it performance on the track and performance in the gym? I'm going to say, how is this different compared to this? Performance on the track versus performance in the gym. So, to get into the topic of what we're going to discuss today, what happens when a race car driver is a type 1 diabetic? Okay. So this leads into our story. And it leads into a story of really what started as an idea back in 2011 and where we've come to now to 2018. Okay. So in the picture, there's myself with a lot less gray hair, and so I just put it up there to go back to the good old days. A friend and fellow doctoral student of me at Texas A&M named Emily Schmidt. In the middle is an individual named Charlie Kimball. So those familiar with Indycar racing will know that Charlie is an Indycar driver. He's currently racing for Carlin Racing this year. You'll also happen to know he's a type 1 diabetic. Okay. Now, he first came to us because, and this, I'm actually going to just take a quick side step and put on my promotion of students at ACSM here for a second. If you're a student, if you have a question you're interested in something, I encourage you to pursue it, because this all started at Charlie's first Indianapolis 500. The announcers broadcast that this is Charlie Kimball. He's a type 1 diabetic. He measures his blood glucose in the race car with a continuous glucose monitor, which I'll probably call a CGM throughout this talk. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. That's really cool. I wonder if we could look at that data and see what's happening over the course of a race. So that idea turned into an email to Charlie's website, and he actually responded with, yeah, I'd like to kind of understand what you do a little bit better. Why don't I come out and we can talk about glucose and racing and human performance and see what develops. So that's where we led into. And what I'm going to talk about today is 2 points. Okay, we're going to address 2 points, and these are really kind of the center on what we worked on with Charlie. So the first is, what is Charlie's physical fitness? But perhaps more importantly, what does it need to be successful in the car? Okay, so we know these individuals need to train, but what do they need to train in order to be a successful race car driver? Because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Now, typically when we're trying to address this question, we can go to our literature, and like I said, there's very literature on this, so we're almost starting at ground zero. And next, the question was, how does blood glucose influence on-track performance? There's no data on that, period. So we really kind of started from scratch there, and we'll go through the ideas that we talked about with that. But let's start with Charlie's physical fitness assessment. So Charlie has been visiting the lab for the past 7 years, and we've done kind of the traditional exercise science lab test on him, which is VO2 max testing, body composition, and Wingate testing, just to get an overall understanding of what his physical fitness is, and then compare that to in-car data to get an understanding of what's going on. So we'll start with cardiovascular fitness, which, as you know, we measure with a VO2 max test. And as you can see, over the years, we've seen a slightly decreasing trend with an increase in his VO2 max. I will say that if you look at the numbers, he is a rather fit individual, which makes sense. You would need to be cardiovascularly fit if every weekend you're in a race car for 2 to 3 hours and your heart rate was 170 to 190 beats per minute. I'm going to highlight one thing right here, is that if you look at 2017, his VO2 max increased. Now this was due to the fact that they were changing the structure of the car. They were removing downforce. So it became less about being strong enough to fight the car around the track. It became more about being able to recover on the long straightaways. Now I've introduced the idea of downforce. And so let's have a little bit of a conversation about this as we talk about his body composition. So in a race car, the ultimate goal is to go fast, right? But more importantly, it's important to go fast through the corners. Okay? Now, if you're going fast through the corners, there's a chance you could spin out. Unless you gave the car a lot of downforce by putting big wings on it, which in theory the wind would force the car into the ground. Okay? But when you do that, you make the car a lot harder to steer. Okay? And remember, I said these cars do not have power steering. So you need to have the other type of power steering, which is a strong upper body. So strong shoulders, strong back, right? And that's how these individuals pilot these cars. It's a lot of shoulder and back work to turn the car and then stabilize the car as it's going through the turn. Now, Charlie never gets happy. He's usually unhappy when I show this graph that shows his percent body fat increased, but he's not here to get upset about it, so that's okay. What I would like to draw your attention to is his lean mass. Okay, let's see if I can just kind of give you a highlight right here. So after 2013, if you follow Indycar racing, you'll notice that this is when they changed the structure of the car to put more of a rear wing on the back. They closed off the back tires a bit, and this led to a lot of downforce being put on the car. So in order to drive the car, Charlie had to increase skeletal muscle power output, which meant increasing muscle hypertrophy, increasing lean mass. Now, coming back to my previous slide and conversation moving forward, the new cars started to remove some of that, so there's not such a reliance on lean mass as there is aerobic capacity. And we see this when we start looking at his power output. So we use the Wingate bike to measure skeletal muscle power output. And what we see is, as Charlie has progressed kind of through the downforce era, as we'll call it, he increased his peak power output. So really this is getting to the point that your physical fitness to drive the race car, you need to be fit, but more importantly, you need to be fit depending on the needs of the car. Okay. We also measure rate of fatigue with the Wingate test to see how quickly someone is able to lose their peak power output. And I want you to think of it from this perspective. If someone needs to turn the race car through a corner and they need to have the strength to hold that car through the turn, if they are fatiguing, they're not going to be able to hold the racing line. And then if the car goes off the racing line, the car will go slower. So I'd love to sit here and tell you that this is the average VO2 max a race car driver should have, their body composition, all that. But the truth is it's not true. And I think that shouldn't be surprising to us in that, like all sports, racing is sport specific. So a race car driver that competes in Formula One may have different fitness needs than someone in Indycar or NASCAR. And in fact, we actually have a paper that's going to be submitted to MSSE soon that describes the different physical fitness variables for different types of racing. And what we see is that in IndyCar, there's a need for a high VO2 max, okay, to maintain that heart rate recovery due to the longer races and competing on these big long stretches, as well as just pure strength to pilot a car that doesn't have power steering and power brakes. So for those of you that don't know, Formula One, NASCAR, and most sports cars actually do have power steering and power brakes. And what we see with those individuals is it's more about being light in the car, so you don't put as much weight in the car. And specifically for Formula One, the only thing that really needs to be strong is your neck, just to resist the G-loads. And if you'd like to hear more details about the various fitness factors that go into different types of racing, I'm happy to respond to those in the questions a little bit later. So let's tackle our second question we want to talk about, which was, how does blood glucose influence performance? Well, simple answer is we need glucose, so of course it does. But what about in a type 1 diabetic? So let's back up and talk a little bit about the Charlie story here. So when Charlie first began racing in IndyCar, he performed worse on oval courses. Okay? So for those of you that are not familiar to IndyCar racing, IndyCar drivers race on two types of tracks. Oval courses, that's where they only turn left, they drive in a big oval. This would be the example of the Annapolis Motor Speedway. Okay? So a big oval, oftentimes the track is banked. There's banking on the track, which helps the car stick to the ground. The other type of course these individuals race on are street or road courses. So this is where there's left and right turns. Think of the Long Beach Grand Prix, the Monaco Grand Prix, no banking. Okay? Now, when you start talking about oval tracks, one of the things that comes up is the degree of banking. So how much the track slants up. Okay? Now that's important because when that happens, you introduced one more G load. Now we've talked about lateral and longitudinal G loading for accelerating, braking, and turning. But let's talk about vertical G loading. So that is the head to butt G loading. Now that's great in racing because if you have vertical G loading, you're actually pushing the race car into the track, allows you to maintain grip. If you have grip, you can go faster. But the race car isn't the only thing exposed to this vertical G load. It happens to be the race car driver as well. Now, from a pure statistics point, like I said, Charlie was performing badly on these oval courses. And we wanted to kind of understand why that might be. We wanted to see what is going on with that. So we thought it'd be great if we could just measure his G tolerance. And we were very lucky enough to have the ability to do this. I'm going to walk you through what you're seeing in the image right here. So this is a lower body negative pressure chamber. There actually might be some of you watching that do blood pressure studies or work with NASA. This box literally is just a box. To give you an idea, what you're looking at is, so we lay Charlie down and we seal him off at the waist. Okay, so we sealed off at the waist, and we have this nice big box right here. Right behind me here is a very large vacuum. And what we do is we turn this vacuum on, and as we are pulling air out of the box, that is simulating G-loading. So what we're doing is we're in theory pulling blood, okay, into his legs. If blood is going away from his legs, or if it's going to his legs, it's going away from his heart and his head. And what this will do is this will determine how much G-forces he can handle. So this was the protocol that was used a lot by NASA to evaluate an astronaut's ability to go in and out of space. So we used a very similar protocol, and in fact, if you talk to Charlie, or I include in this opinion, is that race car drivers are really fighter pilots on the road. Okay? The vehicles they drive are equally as advanced, and the loads they're exposed to are very similar. So we did this over a couple of years where we measured his G tolerance. And what you see is we've kind of plotted this graph right here. Now I'm going to orient you to the graph. What you're looking at is this negative number is in negative millimeters of mercury. So this is how much pressure we are pulling out of the box, so how much vacuum. So a lower number is better. Okay? And if we kind of looked at this overall as an average, these are very good numbers, a lot better than the average population. However, 2013 stands out as kind of a sore thumb here. Okay? What I'm going to show you here is these numbers correspond to his average blood glucose during the test. And what we saw was the higher his blood glucose, the worse he performed on a lower body negative pressure chamber test. So this led to the idea that if he's experiencing a bout of hyperglycemia, could that impair his G tolerance, and would that affect his driving performance? And in fact, when we look at the systolic blood pressure from these years, so this is negative pressure exposed, so each stage of the test, so the longer you can go, the more G tolerance you have. And we measure systolic blood pressure, well, actually all blood pressure through this, but I'm just showing you systolic blood pressure. What we see in 2013 was he had a sharp drop in systolic blood pressure. Now this proposed mechanism is what we thought was going on when we were experiencing this. So being a diabetic, having higher blood glucose, I won't walk through all the steps of this, but basically leads to an impairment in vasoconstrictive properties. So he's having more vasodilation. He cannot return blood back up to his heart and his head. It's staying in his legs a little bit longer, and that could impair his performance. Well, that's great, but this is one instance. We don't really have a way to confirm this. It's really just anecdotal. So I'm going to bring you back to what I started with when I first started talking about this, was how I met Charlie, where I saw he measured his blood glucose in the car. So what we were able to do is we went back over several years, okay? And since his car actually measures his blood glucose with him, that blood glucose value, you can see it right there, is linked into the car's data system. So not only do you have blood glucose, but you have every variable related to the car: engine temperature, oil temperature, steering angle. More importantly, you also have how well he's doing on the track, lap time, gap behind the leader. And so we had this idea of, if blood glucose influences performance, could we do some statistical modeling to try and find out an exact window for him to be in? So that's what we did. So we did a regression analysis and multi-level modeling to try and predict, or at least give a clue to, what was the optimal range for him to compete at. So we accounted for any mechanical issues on the cars, type of track he raced on, his how competitive his other racers were. We used Las Vegas odds to try and determine how to grade that individual, whether it be an Elio Castroneves versus someone that's racing their first Indy 500. And we did this over 2 seasons. And from this, we were able to kind of find out that there is a range that if he is in an ideal blood glucose range of 130 to 150, then he, on oval courses, this only relates to oval courses, he will actually be 4 seconds closer to the leader over the course of a race. So I'm going to kind of give you some context now. Charlie is the first type 1 diabetic race car driver. So when he became doing this, his physician said, I would rather you have high blood sugar during the race than go too low. And that was kind of just the range that was given. So from this, we were able to kind of latch onto this target that actually influenced his performance. So with this target blood glucose, instead of saying let's just have a high blood sugar, let's have an ideal range, because we know it will optimize your G loading on ovals. From that, Charlie with his team won the 24 Hours of Daytona. He got his first Indycar win at Mid-Ohio, and he had his best finish of 3rd at the Indianapolis 500. Now, that's fine, that's wonderful for Charlie, but really I've identified one case study, and I'm sure there's several of you that are about to flood the question board with what he ate, does this relate to other individuals, and I'm going to simply say there needs to be more motorsport research, particularly because Charlie was the first type 1 diabetic race car driver. However, since then, there have been 4 other individuals at the elite level of racing in Indycar, NASCAR, and sports car. A rough survey indicates that because Charlie's been such a great ambassador, there are somewhere between 100 and 200 individuals that are competing in minor leagues of racing that happen to be type 1 diabetics, and they don't have this information, and it needs to be out there. In fact, if you look at articles published by Sport, I realize this is from 2014, this happens to be the one year that had the most motorsport publications in the last 10 years, there is only 3 articles ever published per year, as compared to, let's say, football and soccer that sees 1,000 published. So it is with that, I end and I simply say thank you for having me. I encourage you to turn into the Indy 500, and I hope that you can watch Charlie perform very well. But more importantly, I realize there might be some of you out there with ideas and questions, and I hope you pursue those in racing, because there needs to be a lot more of us out there doing it. And with that, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, David. At this time, I want to remind everyone that if you have questions for David, to go ahead and enter those into the question area on the GoToWebinar screen. We're going to start with some questions here from staff in the Indianapolis office. I'll kick us off. So you mentioned that the 130 to 150 was sort of the ideal range for Charlie. How does that compare to what we know about the ideal range for other sports? That's my first question. And then what methods does he use during the race to manipulate his blood sugar?
Sure. So I think I'll do the second question first, and then that'll help me answer the first question, if that's all right with you, Lynette. So in the race, Charlie uses a continuous glucose monitor, measures blood glucose, and that sends a wireless signal to his steering wheel. And that's how he keeps track of his blood glucose. Now, while he's racing, he has 2 drink bottles in the car. Most drivers only have 1. He has 1 drink bottle that is straight water, and the other is orange juice, like a high glucose mixture. He has a valve on his belt that he can adjust that's going to help him choose what bottle he wants to drink. He has the orange juice there in case he goes too low, so he can raise his blood sugar. He does not use an insulin pump or give himself insulin during the race, primarily because when he started doing this, there was concern that due to the high temperatures I talked about earlier, that the insulin would denature or not have a similar effect as if it was not heated. So That's why we went away from the insulin pump. Instead, he uses the insulin pens. He eats the same pre-race meal every time, so he knows how many carbohydrates he's consuming. And with that being said, there's never been an incident where he's gone too low or too high. The ideal blood glucose, so I will say that for those of us with a functioning pancreas, right, we don't have to worry about this. Our ideal blood glucose is just to stay fed and hydrated during competition. As it relates to other type 1 athletes and other sports, it really depends on the sport in question. And this comes up, the other issue is that there's limited literature on the elite athletes. So if you look at Gary Hall, when he was an elite level swimmer, he would get in the pool and have about a very high blood glucose getting out, and then it would decrease. So he actually had to do a little bit of glucose priming versus some other sports such as mixed martial arts. It depends on, you want to have that same type of thing. If you're on a power sport, you want to have some glucose available. But this brings up a very interesting point in that there needs to be more research done to actually help us define all other elite type 1 diabetics.
Great, thank you.
Very welcome.
We have another question.
Hi, this is Gretchen Pack at the national office. My question was, so you mentioned that he saw improvements in his oval track performance. Did he also see performance on the street races, if you will?
Yeah, he did actually. So the big driver for glucose on performance, a lot of the variance was accounted for by being an oval track. Okay, but one of the other kind of minor tests we did on him was we tried to measure his reaction time at various blood glucose levels. And what we found was that when he's in this range, his reaction time is optimal. Actually, when he's outside the range, it's still better than the average population, but when he's in this range, it is optimal, and that's what helped him on the street courses. So with a street course, there's a lot of attention placed on hitting your mark, so driving the right racing line, and sometimes you have to change that based on who's around you. So having that optimal reaction time improved his performance. And I think it shows for the fact that his first win was on a street course at Mid-Ohio.
Great. All right. So this question is from someone watching remotely, Tim. Asks, what's the difference in the type of fitness needed between Indycar versus a NASCAR driver?
Very good question. So we've actually, this kind of became a side project from Charlie's study, in that we wanted to have national, basically, demographics for various sports. Okay? So typically what we see with Indycar drivers is high VO2 max, more lean mass, a lot of strength. Okay. However, when you shift over to NASCAR drivers, they have a slightly less VO2 max, not substantial. I mean, average probably around 52 mils per kg per minute. Their percent body fat is slightly higher than IndyCar drivers, but what's really interesting is the neck strength, actually. So I didn't talk too much about neck strength, but under cornering, acceleration, braking, the neck is really the only free moving part of your body. Okay, and you have to have a lot of strength to maintain your neck in position, because if your neck slides side to side, if it's moving, that actually affects your vision. And if it's affecting your vision at 200 miles an hour, that's going to be impaired, right? So what we saw with NASCAR drivers was that one side of their neck was actually stronger than the other, because they're constantly on the banked ovals holding their head in position. So they had one side of the neck being higher. The other thing that was really interesting is NASCAR drivers, especially the female NASCAR drivers, have a very high G tolerance. So in the LBMP chamber, I showed Charlie, over the years we measured Charlie, his average was about 92 millimeters of mercury. NASCAR drivers seem to be closer to 100, with females being closer to negative 110 millimeters of mercury. So just being exposed to those vertical G loads on those bank tracks, in order to be successful, they have to either have that G loading or adapt to it.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. We have another question here. This is from Kyle. Are there any data on glycogen depletion and plasma glucose levels during IndyCar racing or any type of training?
In IndyCar racing, no. There's definitely information out there on glycogen depletion in your typical endurance sports, so triathlon, Ironman. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on who actually did the study, but they did show that if you can deplete glycogen and then have a training bout followed by carbohydrate loading, you're actually able to store more glycogen in your muscle. And if I'm completely honest, I think we're having conversations here about the role of glycogen in racing, because we do see such glycogen mobilization and raising in blood glucose. But yeah, in IndyCar racing, actually in racing at all, there is very little metabolic studies.
Great. All right, we're going to backpedal for just a second. So given your earlier comment on the level of fitness and strength needed for IndyCar, two questions, how much of an advantage do male drivers have over the women drivers? And then you commented that women may have better G tolerance. Can you speculate on why that might be? Sure.
So actually, I'm going to take those two questions and do a little run with a study we actually have going on right now. So for those of you that follow social media and racing, there's been a lot of attention lately saying that females are not strong enough to drive the race car. They say that just the pure strength to pilot the race car, females don't have the lean mass to do it, and that's why we don't see a lot of females in racing. Honestly, the way we started the study was we heard that and we said, well, we have the equipment and the ability to actually measure that. So we have a study going on now, and my hope is that we'll have it in review come August, where we've been comparing physiological responses in the race car between males and females, so in the same type of car, and we've also been bringing them in the lab to kind of compare them a bit. So what we see is we do see that females have less lean mass. That's expected, right? So we do see that because they are smaller individuals, they have less lean mass, but that's not really a big player in terms of cars that don't have power steering or power brakes. That's kind of a negated argument. However, one of the very interesting things that we've started to see is females have higher G tolerance. Okay, so based on that, they would be better competitors on ovals. Okay, the other thing that we're seeing is that females don't have such a sharp rise in core temperature. So I said earlier that typically we see drivers get a core temperature close to between 39 and 40 degrees C over a 2-hour race. However, in the females, that's typically about 20 to 25% less than that, and that could be due just to their size. But anecdotal evidence from the drivers say that females do not complain about the heat as much. Okay, so we're still collecting data on this. We've been very lucky in that we got data from sports car drivers, stock car drivers, and we're working on finishing up the open wheel drivers. And so once we have this nice package put together, we can put that out. But I'll throw you the conclusion that I think is going on. So every time I share this data, people will say, well, then how come, if females are so much better at the stresses exposed to race car drivers, how come they're not as successful? Well, this gets into, so I always say I'm a neck down physiologist. This is the neck up stuff. The truth is, female drivers are a rarity, and there are sometimes where sponsors will latch on to a female driver because this is something they want to be behind. And when they do that, they actually progress the driver up to maybe a higher level of competition they're not ready for yet. So one of the best ways to develop a race car driver is to have seat time, to actually get practice in the car at a level of competition you're used to. So accelerating a female driver up too quickly may almost shoot them in the foot away. It's not because their physiology is bad. It's just because they don't have the practice yet. I think I answered both those questions there, Lynette. I'm sorry if I didn't.
Yeah, you did. That was great. So we have another question here from Star. Have you had any non-diabetic drivers requesting these types of tests or blood glucose monitoring during the race, and would there be any utility in that for those drivers that are non-diabetic, or could it inform our understanding for diabetic drivers as well?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we started measuring blood glucose in all of our drivers we work with. Simply because we were seeing what was going on with Charlie, we wanted to see, okay, what's the non-diabetic physiology. So we measure blood glucose in all our drivers, and we also see a rise in blood glucose with racing. Now, we're not so concerned about a target glucose level with those individuals, but we are concerned with, this is an endurance type of sport, so there is such a thing where we need to have glucose replenishment. So if you look at the endurance races where individuals will race for 24 hours and do multiple stints, we can use that information to replenish their glycogen stores, so to refuel them. So yes, absolutely, we use it, but not to the fine-tuned detail we did with Charlie, just because they have a working pancreas, and it becomes more about proper nutrition and proper hydration at that point.
Okay, great. We have another question here in the national office.
Yeah, this is Robin Stewart. So at the beginning of your talk, you showed some of the testing protocols you did, Wingate, aerobic capacity, and strength. And because there's a lot of upper body strength, isometric strength involved in car racing, I was wondering what kinds of tests that you, used to evaluate that in the drivers.
Sure. So as we've done this, it's kind of, I always say it's like, we're starting in a black room and we're trying to shine light on where to look and where to go. So in terms of upper body, we do two tests. We use a neck strengthening system, so try and get an idea of isometric strength of the neck, and we have dynamometers and collars that we use to measure that. In terms of the shoulder strength, and actually, I feel free to email me and have this conversation about the best way to look at shoulder strength for a race car driver. We actually use a ski ergometer where they pull on the cables to see how many watts they can produce and how long they can maintain a certain power output over time. Because the truth is, it's not about turning the wheel once, it's about turning the wheel, holding it at a certain tension, and then repeatedly turning it. I'm not entirely sure if that's the best tool to use, because the one thing that's not included in that is vibration. And the one thing I didn't talk about this is how the vibration of the car influences physiology and performance. So please, I'll scroll back up to my email. If you have an idea of what's the best way to do that, please do. Please contact me and let me know what you think.
Okay, this is a very practical question, but seemingly important. Given the hot weather forecast for Indy this weekend, do you limit Charlie's off-track activities, such as the 500 parade and other outdoor festivities prior to Sunday's race? Does he have to prepare differently given the heat?
That is a fantastic question. I've told Charlie several times, I don't think you need to do the parades, do the media tours, and do all that. And he says, great, I will stop that the minute you can write me a check for $10 million to cover the sponsorship that I'll lose if I do that. And I say that jokingly, but this brings up an excellent conversation in that if you were to go to the World Series, you will not see any member of the Yankees letting fans walk through their dugout, signing autographs, taking photos 2 hours before the race. That wouldn't happen. But that happens in racing. Okay? So that is a part of it. We can't change it, but we can optimize for it. So Charlie's done a great job of building structure around him. So he knows he needs to be hydrated. So throughout this weekend, he has a hydration plan. He knows he needs sleep. He knows he needs his nutrition. So he has a plan for that. And one of the ways that he's done that is he has a motorhome that he parks at the track, so you don't have to deal with traffic getting into the race. He limits, his outings that he has to do, so it's only required by the by the Indycar or by the sponsor. And other than that, that puts them on a level playing field with every other driver out there. I remember at the Houston race several years ago in the autograph session, there were aides just bringing water bottles to all the drivers. So they're aware of it. And I think that's just a unique nature of racing that everyone has to deal with a bit.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, David. This has been a really fabulous introduction to the work that you're doing, and I think for our students who are listening remotely, this, is just another sort of exposure to the breadth of the work that's going on at ACSM. And fortunately, it sounds like there's lots of room for more work to be done in this field. So we really appreciate your time. And with that, we are going to end our brown bag. Thanks, everybody, for participating, and thanks again to David. And we look forward to hosting more of these in the future and hope you'll plan to join us.
Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate your time.